The summer of 2022 arrived in Kerr County, Texas, the way summers arrive in the hill country, without negotiation, without the gradual warming that more forgiving climates offer as a courtesy before the heat sets in for real. One morning in late May, the thermometer outside the Callaway machine shed read 81 degrees at 7 in the morning, and by the following Tuesday, it hadn't dropped below that at dawn for 6 consecutive days. The limestone outcrops that ribbed the pastures held the heat through the night and released it back into the air before the sun cleared the eastern ridge so that the mornings felt borrowed from the previous afternoon rather than freshly arrived. The blue stem and side oats, grama, in the lower paddocks stayed green because the soil held moisture down deep where the roots reached, but the surface of the ground cracked in the high spots, the caliche showing white through the grass like old bone. The cattle on Callaway Stockworks knew what the heat meant before the calendar confirmed it. By the second week of June, they were moving differently, not the steady, purposeful drift of animals grazing with their full attention, but the restless, interrupted movement of animals working against something. They'd lower their heads to graze for 30 or 40 seconds, then lift them, tails switching, legs stomping at the ground in a rhythm that had nothing to do with contentment. By 9 in the morning, the worst of them were bunched under the live oaks along the draw that ran through the south paddock, standing close together in the particular way cattle stand when they're trying to use each other as barriers against something that can't be blocked. The flies had come early that year, not gradually the way old-timers in Kerr County said flies used to come building over 3 or 4 weeks until they reached their summer numbers, but all at once, as though something in the wet spring had tipped a balance somewhere, and the arithmetic of insect reproduction had simply resolved itself overnight into a number that made the cattle miserable. Horn flies covered backs and shoulders in dark shifting masses. Face flies gathered at the eyes and nostrils of the calves, whose small bodies carried the burden of infestation with less tolerance than the cows. Stable flies worked the legs, biting at the ankles until the cattle stomped and shifted and crowded the fence corners in search of relief that the fence corners couldn't provide. Dale Callaway had been running cattle on this ground for 35 years. He'd been born in western Oklahoma, the son of a dryland wheat farmer who'd taught him that the land owed you nothing and that anything it gave you came from what you put into it first. He'd come to Kerr County in his mid-20s with a used stock trailer, a border collie named Poke, and enough money to make a down payment on 40 acres of cedar-choked hill country ground that the bank was quietly relieved to have someone take off their hands. He'd cleared the cedar by hand over 3 winters, pulled rock out of the upper pastures with a tractor and a chain, and built the first fence line himself using posts he'd cut from the cedar he'd cleared. Nothing on Callaway Stockworks had arrived without Dale's direct labor attached to it. And that fact was legible in the way he moved through the property slowly, with the deliberate attention of a man reading something he'd written himself and checking it for errors. He was 61 years old in the summer of 2022. His hair had gone from dark brown to the color of old cedar bark, and his face carried the particular weathering of a man who'd spent 4 decades outside in a climate that didn't soften its intentions. His hands were large and rough at the knuckles, and he had a habit of drying them on the red shop rag he kept folded in his back pocket, even when they weren't wet, the way men develop habits that are really a form of thinking. He didn't talk much. He'd found over the years that talking used up energy that was better spent watching. And watching, really watching with attention rather than just eyes, was the thing that had kept Callaway Stockworks solvent through drought years and market downturns in the particular brand of slow catastrophe that comes from making decisions based on what you hope is true rather than what you can actually see. His wife Marge had grown up in Fredericksburg, the daughter of a peach orchardist, and she brought to the marriage a practical intelligence that expressed itself not in directives, but in a quality of observation so thorough that she rarely needed to say what she'd noticed, because the people around her eventually noticed it themselves. She was 58, compact and efficient in her movements, and she had a way of positioning herself in rooms and conversations that let her see everything without appearing to watch. She ran the household finances with a spiral notebook and a mechanical pencil, and in 33 years of marriage, she had been wrong about a financial decision exactly twice a record that Dale acknowledged silently by deferring to her on any question involving money without making a ceremony of the deference. Their older daughter, Wren, had been away at Texas A&M for 4 years and had come home in May with a degree in animal science, a duffel bag, a laptop whose charging cable was held together with electrical tape, and a quality of attention that her parents recognized immediately as their own, concentrated and refined by 4 years of formal instruction into something more specific and more restless than either of them had seen in her before. She was 26, dark-haired, narrow-faced, with the boots she'd had since her junior year of high school worn down at the right heel from the way she planted her weight when she was thinking. She carried a yellow notebook everywhere, the kind with a cardboard cover that cost $1.19 at the hardware store, and she had a habit of stopping mid-stride to write something down that made her look to anyone who didn't know her like a person who'd forgotten something. To the people who did know her, it looked like what it was, a person catching a thought before it moved on. Dale had expected Wren to come home and work. She'd grown up doing the work, knew the rhythms of the operation, knew which gates stuck and which water lines ran slow in summer, and which paddock the South herd preferred in July. What he hadn't expected, what he hadn't considered because he hadn't had occasion to consider it, was that she'd come home and look at things, not do things. Look. The first week she was back, she walked the paddocks every morning before breakfast. Not to check the cattle in the way Dale checked them, moving with purpose from one task to the next, noting what needed doing and doing it. She walked them slowly, stopping at intervals, crouching down to look at things that were on the ground rather than standing above it. She took photographs with her phone. She wrote in the yellow notebook. She asked questions at dinner that seemed to Dale to be about the wrong things, not about the cattle or the market or the summer grazing plan, but about timing. How long after the cattle moved out of a paddock before the next rotation came through? How the manure pats in the low moisture areas compared with the ones in the draws that stayed wetter longer? Whether the fly pressure was worse in some paddocks than others. Dale answered what he could. For the rest, he said he hadn't paid close attention to those particular things, which was true and which he said without embarrassment, because in 35 years of ranching, he'd never had occasion to pay close attention to those particular things. What Wren was seeing and what she was beginning to understand with a precision that the walkthroughs were helping her build was a cycle. Cattle grazed a paddock. They left manure distributed across the paddock in a pattern that reflected their movement, clustered at the fence corners and under the shade trees spread thinner in the open ground. Within hours of deposit, flies found the manure. They laid eggs. The eggs hatched into larvae. The larvae fed and grew and pupated in the moist interior of the pats, protected from the heat by the mass of organic material above them. And 7 to 10 days after the cattle had moved out of the paddock, the next generation of adult flies emerged and spread into whatever paddock the cattle now occupied. She'd learned this sequence in a pasture management elective during her junior year, taught by a professor who had worked with intensive rotational grazing systems in the southeastern United States before coming to Texas. The professor had spent one lecture on what he called the ground-level flywheel, the self-reinforcing cycle of manure deposit larval development in adult emergence. That meant no matter how many adult flies you killed, you were always fighting the generation that was already in the ground behind you. He'd mentioned briefly at the end of that lecture that historically many ranching operations had used poultry to interrupt the cycle at the larval stage, moving chickens through pastures behind larger livestock to scratch open manure deposits, eat larvae, disrupt the development timeline. He'd mentioned it as a historical practice that had been largely displaced by chemical controls, noted that the research on its efficacy was limited but suggestive, and moved on to the next topic. Wren had written it in her notebook. She'd come back to it more than once in the 2 years since reading what she could find on pasture-based poultry systems, mixed species grazing studies, the specific biology of the manure-breeding fly species that cause the most economic damage to beef operations. What the literature told her was that the timing was everything. Move chickens through too soon within a day or two of cattle, and the eggs hadn't hatched yet, and there was nothing to eat. Move them through too late after day 10 in summer temperatures, and the larvae had already pupated, burrowed into the soil beyond the reach of scratching. The window was 3 to 5 days, depending on temperature and moisture, when the larvae were present, active, accessible, and not yet ready to emerge. She found the note in early June. She was looking for a specific wrench in the toolbox that lived on the workbench in the machine shed, one she'd borrowed from Dale 2 summers ago and returned to the wrong drawer. And in searching for it, she opened the wooden box that sat on the top shelf above the workbench. The box that had been on that shelf since before Dale had bought the property that the previous owner had left behind, that nobody had opened more than twice in the years since. Inside was a collection of items that accumulated the way things accumulate when a box becomes the designated place for things that don't have another place. A broken compass, 3 rifle cartridges of uncertain age, a folded road map of Texas that predated the interstate highway numbers as they currently appeared, a receipt from a feed store in Comfort dated 1987. Under all of it, a piece of graph paper folded in quarters, the folds gone soft with time. She unfolded it. The handwriting was in pencil, fine-pointed, the letters formed in the deliberate way of someone who'd been taught penmanship seriously. Chickens follow cattle. Always. Don't let the ground go dead. It wasn't signed. The paper wasn't dated. She had no way of knowing whether it had been written by the man who'd owned the property before Dale, or by someone before him, or whether it had arrived in the box, the way things arrive in old boxes, without clear origin as a transmission from a practical intelligence that had since dispersed. She folded it back along its existing creases, photographed it with her phone, and put it in the breast pocket of her flannel shirt. She didn't show it to Dale yet. She wasn't sure why, except that the note felt like something that needed to earn its moment rather than be produced immediately. What she needed first was a plan that didn't depend on the note, a plan that could stand on its own because it was sound, not because a piece of old graph paper seemed to endorse it. She sat at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in the second week of June and laid out 3 pages in front of Dale. He was eating the last of his dinner. Marge was rinsing dishes at the sink, her back to the table, in the way she had of being present in a room while giving the people in it the architecture of privacy. The plan was specific. A mobile chicken shelter built on a steel skid frame light enough to pull with the ATV across most terrain, heavy enough to be stable in the hill country wind, big enough for 60 to 80 laying hens, designed to move through the paddock rotation behind the cattle on a 3 to 5 day delay. The chickens would scratch open the manure pats, eat the larvae at the stage when they were most accessible, spread the organic material thinner, and leave behind their own manure as a nitrogen deposit. The rotation would continue independently of the chemical program. Wren wasn't proposing to replace fly tags or porons. She was proposing to address the part of the cycle that the chemical program couldn't reach. Dale set his fork down. He looked at the 3 pages. He looked out the window toward the south paddock where the cattle were just visible as shapes in the early evening light under the live oaks. He said, "We already have chickens." Wren said those chickens were different. They had a flock of 14 hens behind the house, the kind of small, semi-ornamental laying operation that accumulates on farms, the way dogs accumulate gradually without a formal decision. Until one day there's a coop that needs maintaining, and a rooster with an inflated sense of his own authority. Those birds had a fixed coop in a fixed run, and they scratched the same 20 square yards of ground every day of their lives. What Wren was describing was a working flock moved on a schedule following the cattle through the rotation. Dale said, "So you want to drag a chicken coop around my cow pastures?" Wren said yes. Dale said, "On purpose." Wren said yes. Marge didn't turn around from the sink, but the line of her shoulders changed slightly. She was listening with the full attention she applied to things she'd already formed a view on and was waiting to see confirmed. Dale asked how much it would cost. Wren had prepared for this question with the seriousness it deserved. The shelter frame could be built from the old hay wagon frame rusting behind the equipment shed. The wheels were seized, but the frame was sound, and the steel was the right gauge for the purpose. Cattle panels, which they already kept on hand, could be bent into a hoop structure over the frame. The tin for the roof could come from the pile of salvage roofing behind the barn. Hardware cloth for the floor, roost bars, nest boxes, a door. These were the out-of-pocket costs along with the birds themselves. She'd priced laying pullets at a breeder near Kerrville. Feed would be an ongoing cost, but the birds would forage substantially from the pasture, reducing the input, and the egg production would generate income that partially offset the feed expenditure. The real cost, she said, was labor. Moving the coop, adjusting the electric netting perimeter, tracking the rotation schedule, collecting eggs. She said she would manage the movement schedule herself. Dale leaned back in his chair. He looked at the 3 pages again with the expression he used when he was reading something he'd already decided to take seriously but hadn't yet decided to accept. He said, "Your grandfather would have laughed at this." Wren said that Dale's father had kept chickens behind the milk cows when Dale was young. Dale looked up. She said she'd read about it not in a book, but in a county agricultural extension history she'd found at the university library, a survey of traditional mixed species management practices in the Edwards Plateau region. The practice had been common enough in the hill country before the mid-20th century that the Extension Service had documented it before it was displaced by the first generation of chemical fly controls in the late 1950s. She said she thought that wasn't coincidence. Dale was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That was different." Wren said, "Was it?" That conversation didn't end with yes. Farm decisions in the Callaway household didn't end with yes at the table. They ended with Dale saying he'd think about it, which in his private language meant he'd decided the idea was serious enough to be considered on its own terms, which was different from dismissal and not yet the same as agreement. Wren had grown up in this house and knew the difference. Marge turned off the faucet. She dried her hands on the dish towel. She said without addressing anyone in particular that she thought a person ought to make sure the wagon frame was actually worth salvaging before they started making plans around it. Dale got up from the table. 2 weeks passed. The flies got worse. The second week of June had been bad. The third week was worse in the way that things get worse in the hill country once the heat and the moisture align into a system that serves something other than human convenience. Wren continued her morning walks. She was building a baseline now, a systematic record of fly loads on cattle, in each paddock photographed, counted, noted in the yellow notebook with date, time, temperature, paddock designation. She'd been doing this since the first week of June, before the chicken plan had been presented, before the conversation at the dinner table. She'd understood from the beginning that whatever case she made would have to be made with numbers, because numbers were the only language Dale Callaway trusted that he couldn't argue with on the basis of personal experience. She was in the machine shed on a Monday morning, looking at the wagon frame with a tape measure, when she heard Dale come in behind her. She didn't turn around. She continued measuring the frame's cross members, writing the dimensions in the notebook. Dale stood behind her for a while. She could hear him breathing the slow, even rhythm of a man who isn't in a hurry, and the occasional sound of the shop rag being unfolded and refolded in his back pocket. He said, "If we're building it right." She turned around. He was already looking at the frame with the evaluative squint he used when he was determining the load-bearing capacity of something. She said, "We're building it." He picked up the tape measure she'd set on the workbench, measured the main rails himself, compared his numbers to hers, and said the frame would need new cross members at 24-inch spacing if it was going to carry the weight of the structure without flex on the rocky ground in the north paddocks. She wrote that down. They built it over 2 weekends. Dale led the structural decisions without making a production of the leadership. He simply did the things that needed doing, in the sequence they needed to be done, and Wren worked alongside him, which was how things had always been built on Callaway Stockworks. His neighbor from the property to the east, Roy Caswell, stopped by on the second Saturday to return a post driver he'd borrowed and stayed for an hour watching them work. He didn't say much. He walked around the structure twice, looked at the skid frame, looked at the cattle panel hoops taking shape over it, and before he left he said, "Interesting," in the tone of a man filing information for later use. The coop was finished on the second Sunday of July. It wasn't beautiful. The tin was salvaged, showing its previous life in the screw holes that had been filled with silicone before the new screws went in. The door stuck slightly at the top unless you lifted it with your knee before pulling. But the frame was solid, the roof was tight, The hardware cloth floor was welded to the skid rails at 6-inch intervals, and the roost bars were set at the right height for the breed. Wren had chosen a heritage dual-purpose bird from a breeder near Kerrville, larger and calmer than a commercial layer, with enough size to discourage the casual opportunism of the red-tailed hawks that work the South Paddock. The day before the cop was finished, Wren drove into Kerrville for supplies. She needed layer pellets, water or nipples, and a coil of poultry netting for the perimeter fence she'd moved with the coop. She stopped at Pruitt Feed on the south end of town, which was the largest livestock supply operation in Kerr County, and had been since Hank Pruitt's father had opened it in 1974. Hank Pruitt was 62 years old, heavy-set in the way of men who have spent their careers standing behind counters rather than walking pastures, with a face that had the particular texture of someone who'd been in the sun enough to tan, but not enough to weather. He'd been selling livestock supplies in Kerr County for 35 years, long enough that his opinions about animal management had acquired in his own mind and in the minds of many of his customers the authority of expertise. He wasn't unintelligent. He knew the products he sold with genuine thoroughness, knew their mechanisms and their limitations, knew which active ingredients were losing efficacy to resistance and which were holding. What he knew less well, because his professional life had never required it, was the biology that existed upstream of the products, the conditions that created the need the products addressed. Wren found the netting on the back shelf, the water or nipples in the bin near the rear counter, the layer pellets on the pallet near the loading dock. She was pushing the flatbed cart toward the register when Hank appeared from the office behind the main counter, coffee in hand, with the ease of a man in a space where everyone knows his name. He looked at the poultry netting on the cart. He looked at the layer pellets. He said, "You starting a chicken operation?" Wren said she was running laying hens in rotation behind the cattle to work the manure. The room had 3 other people in it. A rancher she recognized from the county road south of Comfort was looking at fly tags on the display rack near the window. 2 men she didn't know were talking near the loading dock door. None of them were paying obvious attention. Hank looked at her over his coffee cup. His expression traveled through something that started as assessment and arrived at amusement, the specific amusement of a man who has heard enough impractical ideas to have developed a reflex for them. He said, "Honey, if chickens fixed flies, we'd all be doing it." Wren said, "Maybe we used to." He smiled, not warmly. He said, "You know what actually fixes flies? Fly control. Tag sprays, feed-throughs, traps. You've got to hit them hard and stay on schedule." He gestured a small motion that encompassed the store and its inventory. "Chickens are going to make a mess, get eaten by coyotes, and give your father one more thing to worry about." Wren said, "They're not supposed to replace the chemical program. They're supposed to interrupt the breeding cycle before it produces the next generation of adults." Hank said, "That sounds like college talk." The man at the fly tag display chuckled. It was a small sound, not malicious, but it occupied the room in the way small sounds do when they confirm something a group was already inclined to believe. Wren paid. She loaded the netting and the pellets into the truck herself without asking for help, which was her custom. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. What had happened in that store would travel. She understood this. Kerr County was not a large community, and the social physics of small ranching communities meant that a story told in Pruitt Feed on a Tuesday became common knowledge by the following weekend. The story that would travel was not complicated. Dale Calloway's daughter, fresh out of college, was going to drag a chicken coop around his pastures to fix the fly problem. The version of the story that traveled would not include the biology or the timing interval or the 8 weeks of baseline data she'd been collecting. It would include the part about the chickens. She understood also that what had happened in the store had not changed anything about the plan. It had changed something about the stakes. She drove home. That evening, Dale was on the porch when she pulled in, sitting in the wood chair he kept at the south end of the porch, from which he could see the gate to the south paddock. He did this sometimes in the early evening, sitting without apparent purpose, which Wren had learned was not purposelessness, but a different kind of attention, diffuse, unhurried taking in the whole, rather than examining any part. She told him what had happened at Pruitt Feed. She told him the exact words Hank had used, not because she needed to report them, but because Dale would hear a version of them within the week, and she wanted him to hear her version first. Dale listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the South Paddock gate. He said, "Hank Pruitt has sold this farm vaccine and mineral supplement for 20 years. He knows the name of every animal we've bought at the Kerrville sale barn for the last decade." A pause. "He's not a stupid man." Wren said she knew that. Dale said, "What he said in that store is going to be what people repeat." Wren said she knew that too. Dale said, "So your numbers better be right." She said, "They will be." He looked at the gate for another moment. Then he got up, folded the chair back against the wall in its customary position, and went inside. The screen door settled closed behind him with the quiet authority of something that has been closing in the same way for years. The 63 birds arrived the following Friday in cardboard carriers from the Kerrville breeder. The number was 63 rather than 60 because the breeder's hatch had produced a favorable surplus, and he'd offered the extra 3 at no additional cost, which was the kind of small, practical generosity that moves through agricultural communities without fanfare. Wren spent the first day getting them settled in the coop, positioned in the house paddock adjacent to the barn, before the rotation began. The birds were 5 months old, past the skittish fragility of chicks, not yet in full production, but closed their combs, showing the deep red of birds coming into lay. They moved through the coop with the exploratory confidence of animals, in a new space investigating the roost bars, the nest boxes, the waterer nipples, establishing the social hierarchies that poultry establish in the first hours of any new arrangement. Marge came down from the house on the second morning and stood at the coop for 15 minutes without saying anything. Then she said the nest boxes were going to need a second access point because reaching into a dark box from the front required a commitment of the whole arm that she wasn't planning to make on a daily basis. Wren built the hinge floor panel into the nest box section the following morning, a modification she would later see Earl Giddens arrive at independently on his own design, which was the kind of convergence that happens when practical people approach the same problem without communicating. The cattle to chicken interval for the first paddock rotation was 4 days. The cattle had moved out of the east paddock on a Wednesday. The chickens went in on Sunday morning. Wren walked the paddock before opening the coop door, photographing manure deposits, noting the density and distribution, counting fly activity at the pat surfaces. The numbers were consistent with her baseline data from the previous weeks, approximately what she'd seen in other paddocks at the same interval post-cattle. She opened the coop door. The hens came out with the unanimous enthusiasm that chickens bring to any open door, spreading across the paddock in a moving wave that reorganized itself almost immediately into something more purposeful. Heads down, feet, working the particular scratching motion that distributes weight through the legs and into the ground in a way that opens compact soil. They found the manure pats within minutes. The scratching intensified. The pats that had been intact, their moist interiors sealed against the July heat, began to come apart under the birds' attention, spreading into thin drying mats of organic material scattered across the grass. Wren watched them work for an hour. She took photographs. She wrote in the yellow notebook. Then she went back to the barn and started the morning's other tasks because the farm had a full summer's worth of work that was not related to chickens. It was the first night that cost her. She had set the electric netting perimeter with what she'd believed was adequate spacing, the standard 12-foot interval between fiberglass stakes recommended by the netting manufacturer for most predator environments. What the manufacturer's standard accounted for was a typical predator environment. What it didn't specifically calibrate for was the coyote population density in the eastern portion of Kerr County, which an old-timer who lived on the county road to the south had once described as aggressive enough to have opinions, and which Wren had noted in the abstract without translating the assessment into a concrete modification of the netting protocol. She found out about her error at 3:40 in the morning, when the sound that reached her through the open bedroom window was not the ordinary night sound of 63 birds sleeping, but something different, higher, compressed into a frequency that woke her before she'd consciously identified what she was hearing. She was out of the house in 40 seconds. The coop was intact. The netting perimeter had been breached at the northeast corner where a coyote had found the point of maximum slack between two stakes and compressed the netting toward the ground far enough to create a gap. Of the 63 birds, 46 were present and accounted for. 17 were not. She stood in the paddock in the dark with her flashlight making a circle on the ground and understood what she was looking at. The error was specific and it was hers. She had read the manufacturer's spacing recommendation and treated it as sufficient without asking whether it was sufficient for her specific conditions. She had been confident, and confidence without the right questions behind it was just a way of going fast in the wrong direction. She sat down on the ground. The night was warm, the limestone and cedar smell of the hill country present. Even at this hour, the stars overhead in the dense, undiluted array that only appears at altitude away from towns. She sat with the weight of the error the way you sit with something you can't undo, not trying to make it smaller, not reaching for the mitigating factors, just letting it be what it was. She heard a truck slow on the county road. Headlights swept across the pasture fence and held, and then the truck pulled off the road and stopped with its lights on, illuminating the paddock in a pale, diffuse glow. Earl Giddens climbed out. He was 71 years old and had apparently been awake at this hour for reasons of his own because he moved without the stiffness of someone recently wakened. He walked to the paddock fence and looked at the scene for a moment. He climbed through the fence without haste. He came and stood near Wren and looked at the netting corner and at the ground beyond it. He didn't say anything for a long time. Long enough that the silence stopped being awkward and became something else, a kind of company that didn't require words to constitute itself. Then Earl said, "The learning that cost you the most is the learning you made yourself." He stayed another few minutes looking at the netting, looking at the paddock. Then he went back to his truck and drove away. In the morning, there were 3 rolls of electric netting in the bed of Wren's truck, placed there sometime before dawn. She knew who had put them there. She never mentioned it to Earl, and Earl never mentioned it to her, and in this way the debt was kept in the form that debts between neighbors are best kept as a understanding rather than a transaction. She respaced the netting at 8-foot intervals with an additional ground-level strand, a modification she'd read about on a poultry management form and had not initially implemented because she judged it unnecessary. She implemented it now. She walked the new perimeter twice before she opened the coop for the second morning. Dale saw the reduced flock count at morning feeding. He didn't ask directly. He looked at the birds, looked at the netting corner where the repair was visible, looked at Wren. Wren said, "Coyote, my fault on the spacing." Dale said nothing. He looked at the paddock for another moment, then turned and went back toward the barn. That was all. No annotation, no retrospective analysis, no offer of comfort that would have required the moment to be something other than what it was. He continued forward, which was his way of saying that she should continue forward, and she understood it completely. The summer of 2022 settled into the pattern of work that defines the hill country between June and September. The heat building by mid-morning to the point where labor becomes a negotiation between necessity and physical limit. The afternoon storms building on the western horizon and sometimes delivering rain and sometimes not, the evenings cooling late and briefly into something that reminded you why people had chosen to live in this particular landscape despite everything it cost them. The cattle rotation moved, the chickens followed, the yellow notebook filled. Wren counted flies. She counted them on cattle backs on legs around the eyes of the calves. She photographed the manure pats before the chickens went in, and after tracking the progression from intact deposits to spread drying organic material. She noted behavior the time the cattle spent grazing versus standing, the bunching patterns, the use of shade. She noted the spray applications her father made, the dates and products, the intervals between applications. She noted egg production as it built through July, the income it generated against the feed costs she tracked to the dollar. By the middle of July, a pattern was visible in the numbers that she hadn't manufactured by wanting to see it. The paddocks where the chickens had completed a pass showed fly counts on cattle that were consistently lower, not absent, not dramatically lower in any single instance, but lower in a way that accumulated across weeks into a difference that was large enough to change what the cattle were doing with their time. The animals in worked paddocks spent more of the mid-morning grazing. The calves lay down in the open ground rather than crowding the shade. The cows weren't stomping every few seconds with the trapped urgency of animals fighting a losing battle. The manure pats in work paddocks dried faster. Wren confirmed this with photographs taken at equivalent intervals, same number of days. Post-deposit different paddocks. The worked pats spread thin and pale at the surface. The unworked pats still dark and compact, and when she opened them with a stick, visibly active. She was precise in her notes about the limitations. One farm, one summer. No controlled comparison. Weather variation between paddocks that she could document but not eliminate. She was a practitioner, not a researcher, and she didn't try to write her data up as something it wasn't. What she had was real and specific and bounded by its conditions, and she intended to present it as exactly that. The Kerr County Cattlemen's Association met monthly at the community center on Junction Highway, in a room that served the full range of community purposes: wedding receptions, 4-H events, volunteer fire department breakfasts, the occasional political candidates forum. The August meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, which was a better night than the association had managed in previous years, when the August meeting had sometimes fallen on haying conflicts that kept attendance thin. Wren put her name on the agenda in the third week of July. She asked for 10 minutes under new business. Jerry Aldrich, the administrative coordinator, confirmed the slot without comment. The rain came to Kerr County the way trouble always comes to that part of Texas, without warning, without apology, and all at once. It started on a Tuesday in the third week of July, which was the third week since Wren had moved the chickens into rotation behind the cattle. The sky had been building for 2 days that particular shade of greenish-gray that old-timers in the hill country called a cedar breaker, because the storms that came with that color had a habit of snapping cedar elms at the root. By 4 in the afternoon, the first thunderhead had stacked itself up over the Guadalupe River drainage to the west, and by 5:30 the rain was falling so hard on the tin roof of the Callaway machine shed that Wren couldn't hear herself think. She stood in the shed doorway with her yellow notebook pressed against her chest, watching the east paddock disappear behind a curtain of water. The chickens were locked in the mobile coop, which she'd positioned on a slight rise at the far edge of the paddock 2 days earlier. The rise had seemed like good thinking at the time. Now, watching the runoff channels filling fast between the limestone outcrops, she wasn't certain the rise was going to be enough. By 8 o'clock that evening, the rain had not stopped. It had moderated slightly from violent to merely relentless, and the east paddock was now holding water in every low spot. Wren put on her rain gear, took a flashlight, walked out to check the coop. The rise it sat on was still above the waterline, but the ground approaching it from the gate had turned into a shallow lake of red clay slurry that grabbed at her boots with every step. She checked the latch, checked the roof seams, confirmed the electric netting was still standing, walked back to the house with mud to her shins. She didn't sleep well. Not because she was afraid the coop would fail, she was reasonably confident it wouldn't, but because she'd been running numbers in her head all evening. The cattlemen's meeting was 3 weeks away. What she had was real. She knew it was real. But real and persuasive were not always the same thing, and the room she'd be walking into was full of men who had been supplied by Hank Pruitt for 3 decades. Men who trusted him with the particular trust that comes from availability and consistency over time. She understood that kind of trust. It didn't make her angry anymore the way it had in May. It made her careful. The rain stopped before dawn. By 5:30, the sky to the east was the color of pewter, and the air that came through Wren's window carried the smell of wet cedar and caliche clay beginning to dry. She was already awake. She pulled on her boots, took her notebook, went out to the east paddock before the house was stirring. The coop was fine. The rise had held. The netting showed one section on the northeast corner that had sagged where a stake had softened in the wet ground. She restaked it with a spare post from the bag, bungeed to the ATV, tightened the lead wire, walked the perimeter twice before opening the coop door. The hens came out in their usual way all at once with complete conviction, as though the hours of confinement had clarified rather than diminished their purpose. They spread across the paddock, heads down, feet working, scratching open the manure pats that the rain had softened and made newly accessible. Wren stood at the paddock fence with her notebook open and counted fly loads on the cattle in the adjoining paddock. She wrote the numbers down. Date, time, temperature, paddock designation fly count, per animal behavioral notes. The behavioral notes were sometimes the most telling data she had because numbers on their own didn't capture the difference between cattle that were grazing steadily and cattle spending a third of their energy in a continuous futile argument with insects. She was riding when she heard Earl Giddens's pale green Ford slow on the county road along the north edge of the property. He was parked on the shoulder with the engine running, a cup of something in one hand, looking out at the east paddock with the particular stillness of a man watching something he's been thinking about for a while. She raised a hand. Earl raised his cup. He didn't pull away for another 5 minutes, and when he did, he went slowly. She noticed him doing this before parking on the shoulder for 10 or 15 minutes in the early morning, watching the chickens work. He'd never asked to come in, never commented directly. The closest thing to communication they'd had about the chickens since the netting incident was the 3 rolls of netting that had appeared in her truck before sunrise. She understood his presence on that shoulder as a form of attention she hadn't been asked to earn, but was being extended anyway. And she treated it with the respect that form of attention deserves. The feed run happened on the same morning. At Pruitt Feed, Hank was on the phone when she arrived. His voice carried across the concrete floor, a customer complaining that pour-on treatments weren't holding past 3 weeks in the summer heat. Hank was explaining with the authority of long practice that residual time was always weather-dependent, that the solution was rotating to a different active ingredient. She listened without appearing to listen. He wasn't wrong about the rotation. He was addressing the symptom with competence. What he wasn't addressing was the cycle producing the symptom. He rang her items through without comment until he reached the layer pellets. He looked at the bag, looked up. His voice was professionally neutral, stripped of the performance quality it had carried in May. "Those chickens still working for you?" She confirmed they were. He asked if she was keeping numbers. She told him 8 weeks of baseline and post-treatment comparisons across 4 paddocks. She told him she'd be presenting at the August meeting. He absorbed this. Then Newcastle risk with open-range poultry near cattle. You thought about that. She had been waiting for this. She told him she'd consulted with the county livestock agent and had reviewed the current veterinary extension literature. Newcastle disease transmission between open-range laying hens and rotational grazing systems and beef cattle was not a supported pathway in the published record. The risk he was describing applied to crowded commercial poultry housed in proximity to other birds, not to what she was doing. She had documentation if he wanted to see it. The words came out level, neither aggressive nor apologetic. She'd rehearsed them past the point where rehearsal was detectable. Hank looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then, "You really got 8 weeks of numbers." She picked up her receipt. Outside loading the feed into the truck bed, she sat on the tailgate for a moment before starting the engine. She thought about what Dale had said the evening he'd finished reading through the extension publication she'd given him, sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on and his coffee going cold, setting the pages down with the deliberateness he applied to final decisions. He hadn't said the documents proved anything systemic. He'd said, "Okay, Hank's wrong on that one." Just that. A correction noted, filed, and closed. That was the evening she'd understood something about her father that she hadn't fully understood in 26 years of knowing him. The trust he gave was thorough. When it came without reservation. The work of earning it was real, but the thing you earned was also real. Dale came to find her in the South Paddock on a Thursday afternoon in late July. He walked out from the gate in the deliberate way that meant he'd been sitting on something for at least a day. Roy Caswell had called that morning, a stalker operator from out near Center Point. Roy had heard about what Wren was doing, not from Wren, from someone who'd talked to someone who'd seen the chickens working from the county road. Roy had questions. Practical ones: breed selection timing between cattle and chickens, coop construction costs, predator control specifics. Dale had answered what he could. For the rest, he'd told Roy to call Wren directly. He didn't look at her while he said this. He looked at the cattle. But there was something in the delivery, no qualification, no editorial buffer between the statement in the air that felt like a different kind of sentence than anything he'd said directly about the project since the evening he'd walked into the machine shed and found her with the tape measure. She wrote Roy Caswell's number in the margin of the yellow notebook. 2 days before the cattlemen's meeting, Jerry Aldrich called. He explained that a concern had been raised, he didn't say by whom, about the evidentiary basis of Wren's presentation, that her data hadn't been independently verified, that the methodology hadn't been reviewed by any credentialing body. The association was considering limiting her to 2 minutes for general comments rather than her 10-minute slot. Wren asked what the standard for presenter verification was at the monthly meetings. Jerry hesitated. She asked whether the product representatives who presented at meetings feed company reps, pharmaceutical reps, insecticide distributors, submitted their data to independent review. He hesitated longer. She thanked him and set the phone down. She sat in the small room with its stacks of extension publications and its yellow notebooks arranged chronologically. She sat for a long time. Not because she didn't know what to do next, but because she wanted to be honest with herself about what she was feeling before she decided how to act on it. The data was real. The methodology was sound for what it was, on-farm observation with consistent technique, not a peer-reviewed trial, but not nothing. The attempt to limit her presentation was not about data quality. She called Earl Giddens. Earl picked up on the second ring. She explained what had happened. He was quiet. She could hear a radio somewhere in the background, a country station kept low. Then Earl said, "What do you need from me?" She told him. He said, "I'll make a call." She didn't ask who he planned to call. Earl Giddens had been in Kerr County for 40 years. He knew everyone. More importantly, in a community where a man's word was still the primary currency of trust, everyone knew him as someone who spent that currency carefully and honored every debt it created. She went back to work on the presentation. At some point after 10 o'clock, Dale appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He set one beside her keyboard without asking whether she wanted it. He looked at the photographs on the screen, the before and after grid of manure deposits, the fly count table organized by paddock and date. She told him about Jerry Aldrich's call. She told him what was behind it or what she believed was behind it. She told him Earl was making a call. Dale looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked at her directly, which he did not do casually. "You've done the work. The work is real. Whatever happens in that room, the ground doesn't change." He left the coffee and went to bed. 2 days later, Jerry Aldrich called again. His voice was different, recalibrated the tone of a man adjusting to a changed circumstance. He said the association had reviewed the matter and was restoring her original 10-minute slot. There had been additional input from association members. He didn't elaborate. She thanked him. After she hung up, she went out to check the coop in the cooling evening. The cattle in the north paddock were moving, really moving, grazing steadily in the last hours of light. She stood at the fence and watched them. The meeting was 2 days away. She had 10 minutes. She had 8 weeks of data, 4 paddocks behavioral observations, egg income figures, feed cost breakdowns, 17 dead hens and 1 summer's worth of proof that the problem everyone was fighting at eye level had been growing unchallenged on the ground beneath their feet. She intended to use all of it. The community center on Junction Highway smelled the way it always smelled on meeting nights. Industrial coffee brewed too strong, the waxy residue of paper plates floor cleaner applied that afternoon over decades of boot scuff. The folding chairs were already set in rows when Wren arrived 40 minutes before the meeting started, carrying her folder and her yellow notebook, and the particular quiet of a person who has finished preparing and is now simply waiting for the thing to begin. She set her materials on the presenter's table, arranged the photographs, confirmed the laptop connected to the projector. Jerry Aldrich tested the display twice and retreated to the back of the room. The members arrived in 1s and 2s parking trucks at angles in the gravel lot, coming in with the residual heat of July still on their forearms, nodding at familiar faces, scanning for the unfamiliar. Wren knew most of them. She'd grown up at the edges of these rooms, sitting beside Dale, when she was too young to understand the agenda, but old enough to read the room, who held weight, whose silences meant disagreement versus respect versus simply waiting. Roy Caswell came in and found Wren near the front. He was compact mid-50s with a handshake that communicated more than most people's first 5 sentences. They'd talk for 40 minutes on the phone, not about whether the system worked, but about logistics, timing adjustments, breed selection for his specific predator environment. He'd listen with the focused attention of someone building something in his head. He found a seat in the second row. Hank Pruitt arrived 7 minutes before the hour brochures under one arm, coffee in hand, moving through the room with the practiced ease of a man who has known every name in it for 3 decades. He stopped at 4 or 5 clusters, exchanged the right number of words, deployed his laugh at the right intervals. He was good at this. She'd never doubted that. He glanced at her table once at the photographs laid out in their grid and looked away with controlled neutrality. The room filled to about 40 people. Curtis Webb, the association president, third-generation rancher, 63, weathered in the permanent way, called the meeting to order. Business moved efficiently through water district updates, lease renewals, fence maintenance schedules. Wren sat with her folder closed on her lap, watching the room the way she'd learned to watch paddocks, not searching for any one thing, attending to the whole. Then Curtis said her name. She stood, moved to the front, looked out at 40 faces in folding chairs under fluorescent light. She knew most of them. She didn't start with data. She started with a question delivered into the particular quiet of a room that had just shifted from administrative business to something it wasn't certain how to categorize. How many of you looked down at the ground this morning, not at your cattle, not at your fence line, at the ground itself? A few people exchanged glances. Nobody answered. That was fine. She hadn't expected an answer. The question did something to the room's attention, tilted it slightly off the axis of skepticism it had been ready to apply, made people consider what they might have walked past that morning without seeing. She said the problem with fly season in the hill country wasn't that people weren't working hard enough. They were. The problem was directional. Everyone was looking at the same part of the problem and applying resources to it, while the part that actually perpetuated the cycle sat undisturbed on the ground in every paddock 3 to 7 days away from producing the next wave. She showed the first photograph, a manure pat 6 days old, unworked cross-section to show the interior. The larval activity was visible even in a photograph taken with a phone camera in ordinary afternoon light. She showed the adjacent photograph, same paddock, same age range, from an area the chickens had worked through 2 days after the cattle moved out. Scratched open, spread, thin surface, dry interior, disrupted. She showed the fly count data, next paddock by paddock, week by week, arranged in a table simple enough that no one needed a research background to read it. She explained the baseline established over 8 weeks, starting in early June before the rotation began. She acknowledged directly that it wasn't a controlled trial. She said, "This is one farm, one summer, imperfect conditions, real results." She let that sit for a moment before moving on. Then she showed the photograph of 17 dead hens. The room shifted. Not dramatically, these were people who'd lost animals, but the shift was real. She'd put the photograph in deliberately the morning after she'd decided to use everything she had, rather than only the parts that reflected well on her. She said, "These died because I made a mistake. I cut corners on the netting installation the first night because I was confident, and confidence without attention is just another word for carelessness." I'm telling you this because if any of you build one of these systems and lose birds in the first week, I don't want you to conclude that the system failed. I want you to check your netting. Something in the room's posture changed. Not agreement, not yet, but the particular engagement that comes when someone at the front stops performing credibility and starts demonstrating it. She moved through this behavioral observation data. The cattle grazing hours, the reduction in spray use in the second half of July, the egg income figures that had partially offset feed costs. She showed the photograph of the mobile coop, the welded frame, the hardware cloth floor, the tin roof, and noted what it had cost in materials versus what it would have cost to build new. Because the answer was considerably less when you started with a wagon frame that had been sitting behind a machine shed for 11 years. She finished with a question that had been organizing her thinking since the morning in early June, when she'd first crouched over a manure pat with a stick. We've been treating the adult fly like it's the whole problem. It's not. It's the part that bothers us enough to notice. She sat down. The room held its quiet for 2 seconds longer than rooms usually hold quiet, which in a room full of ranchers is a significant unit of time. Then the question started. Roy Caswell went first, asking about timing adjustments in hot weeks versus wet weeks. She answered in specific terms the temperature thresholds that accelerate larval development, the interval adjustments she'd made during the late June heat, the way she'd recalibrated during the rainy week in July. Roy wrote in a small notebook he'd produced from his shirt pocket. A man named Willis Cracked, running a cow-calf operation near Comfort, asked about coyote pressure in the eastern part of the county. She walked him through the netting protocol she'd developed after the first incident, closer post spacing the ground level strand, the importance of checking tension after soft ground events. A woman with a small dairy near Ingram asked whether the chickens disturbed the cattle. Wren said the cattle had investigated the coop from a respectful distance for about half a day and then returned to grazing with what she could only describe as indifference. Cows, she noted, were excellent at ignoring things that offered neither food nor threat. A brief, genuine laugh moved through the room. It released something. Then Hank Pruitt spoke from the back right section. His voice carried the practiced weight of a man who knew how to use the acoustics of a space he'd used many times. What happens in a wet year when you can't move that coop? Wren looked at him. Same thing that happens when 3 inches of rain washes spray off a cow's back in 45 minutes. One beat. No system works in every condition. That's my point. The answer isn't one tool. It's layers used with attention to what's actually happening on the ground. Hank held her gaze for a moment. He looked down at the coffee cup in his hands, rotated it slightly, looked back up at the room rather than at her. There were other questions. She answered each with the same quality of attention, not hurrying, not deflecting, not performing expertise she didn't have. When someone asked something she didn't know, she said she didn't know. Then Dale Calloway stood up. He rose from the third row where he'd been sitting since before Wren arrived in the seat beside Marge, his Stetson on his knee and his coffee untouched beside him. He had not attended a Kerr County Cattlemen's Association meeting in more than 10 years, not since the year his back had kept him close to the house for 3 months, and the habit of attending had simply not resumed when his back improved. The people in the room who knew him well enough to know this, and in 40 people, there were at least 15 who did register his presence with a quality of attention that the room's ambient noise didn't fully reflect. Dale was not a public speaker. He had given perhaps 3 speeches in 61 years, all brief, all at occasions where brevity was the only form of eloquence available. He stood in the third row of folding chairs under fluorescent light in a room full of people who had known him for decades as a man who was consistently, dependably himself, and he looked at them for a moment before he spoke. His voice came out low and unhurried, shaped around words that had been sitting with him long enough to lose anything unnecessary. I spent 35 years on that ground looking at what I could see. My daughter spent this summer looking at what I'd stopped seeing. He didn't look at Wren while he said it. He looked at the room. That's all I've got. He sat down. Nobody said anything for 3 seconds. Then Curtis Webb moved to the next agenda item with the quiet decisiveness of a man who recognizes when a room has reached a point where more words would only diminish what's just been said. After the meeting formally closed, the room dissolved into post-meeting conversation. People gathered in clusters, refilled coffee, moved toward the exit at varying speeds. Wren stayed at her table answering follow-up questions from 3 ranchers who'd waited rather than asked publicly. Roy Caswell lingered until the last of them left, then told her he planned to start with 25 birds on 1 paddock rotation and asked if she'd be willing to do a site visit before he broke ground. She said she would. Willis Crockett stopped on his way out to say his wife had asked him to find out what the egg income looked like on a per-bird-per-week basis. Wren wrote the figure in the margin of a page she tore from her notebook and gave it to him. She was stacking the last of her photographs when Hank Pruitt appeared at the edge of the table. He didn't approach quickly. He came measuring the territory before committing to it. He stood on the opposite side of the folding table looking at the before and after photographs still laid out on the surface. The intact pat with its visible interior activity, the disrupted pat spread thin across the grass. He picked up the intact Pat photograph, looked at it, set it down. His voice came out quieter than it had been at any point in the evening, stripped of its public register. You really kept all of it. 8 weeks. Wren confirmed she had. He was quiet for a moment. Then that coupe, you have drawings on it. She told him she had dimension notes, not formal drawings, but specific enough for a competent welder to follow. What he said next, he said without looking up from the table. I've got a customer out near Mountain Home, 800-acre stalker operation. He called me after the meeting tonight. He wants to know more about the chicken rotation. A pause that contained something she chose not to name. I told him I'd find out. Wren waited. Hank set the photograph down squarely in its place, the way a man sets something down when he's decided it's worth treating carefully. He said she could send the sketches to his store email, and he'd pass them to the Mountain Home customer along with the timing information. He wasn't asking for partnership or credit or anything that required the conversation to become more than it was. He was adjusting. She said she'd send them. He nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a transaction, picked up his brochures, and walked toward the exit. At the door, he paused without turning. It's a lot of work. She said it was. He left. Marge appeared beside Wren a few minutes later, helping stack the remaining materials into the folder. They walked out together into the parking lot, where the July night had cooled to something almost reasonable, the stars visible over the limestone hills to the east, in the deep, uninterrupted way. They're only visible far enough from town to let the sky be what it is. Dale was already at the truck, standing beside the driver's door, with his Stetson back on, watching the lot empty. He looked at Wren when she reached the truck. He said, "You eat anything since noon?" She hadn't. He said there was leftover brisket in the refrigerator. They drove home on the county road with the windows down, the cedar smell coming through clean in the night air, the headlights finding limestone outcrops on the curves and releasing them one by one into the dark behind. Nobody spoke much. The kind of quiet that rode home with them was the kind that doesn't need filling. The following spring came to Kerr County, the way spring comes in the hill country. The mountain laurel blooming purple along the drainage draws in February, the live oaks leafing out in that pale green that lasts exactly 2 weeks before hardening into summer color. The blue stem and side oats grama greened up in the lower paddocks by mid-March. The first serious fly pressure wouldn't arrive until May, which gave Wren 4 months. She used them. Roy Caswell's setup was the first she helped with outside of Callaway Stockworks. His coupe design differed from hers. He'd opted for a lighter frame to navigate steeper paddock terrain, trading structural mass for maneuverability, which required more careful attention to roof bracing. They spent a Saturday in February working through the modifications, Roy's son Garrett handling the welding while Wren held dimensions. Marge, who had driven out with Dale, sat in a lawn chair near the gate and read a paperback she'd been trying to finish since October. Dale spent the day watching, occasionally offering observations about the hydraulic circuit on Roy's old tractor, which had nothing to do with chickens and was exactly the right way for Dale to spend a day. Patsy Drummond called in March after getting Wren's number from Willis Cracked. Patsy was 58, had been ranching her own ground for 30 years, and had zero patience for systems she didn't understand the reason for. She asked questions for 90 minutes on the phone before agreeing to a site visit. At the visit, she asked questions for 2 more hours walked. Every paddock looked at the ground with the specificity of someone who had been looking at ground for 3 decades. She said she wanted to start with 40 birds and would Wren recommend a breed for her predator environment. Wren recommended the same heritage dual-purpose breed she'd use, size over speed, calm temperament, better suited to open paddock conditions than commercial layers. They spent another hour on breeds before Patsy shook her hand and said she'd be in touch. The Mountain Home customer, Gerald Fitch, 800 acres, called Wren directly in early April. He'd received the cup sketches she'd sent through Hank's store email, which confirmed that Hank had passed them along. Gerald had specifically financial questions, his scale making the per-bird economics look different than they did on a smaller operation. Wren walked him through the math, acknowledged where her single-farm data didn't extrapolate cleanly to 800 acres, suggested he run a trial on 1 rotation unit before committing to the full system. Gerald said he appreciated that she told him where the data ran out rather than pretending it didn't. He placed an order for 60 laying hens from the Kerrville breeder and called a local welder about a frame. In the second week of April, Earl Giddens called from his landline and said he was ready to build. He'd been thinking about it since July. Over the winter, he'd drawn his own sketches on graph paper, modified from what he'd observed through his windshield on those early mornings parked on the county road shoulder. He wanted Wren to look at the drawings before he started. She drove over that afternoon. Earl's farm was 8 miles on a gravel road that turned to chip seal near his gate, and the operation had the look of a place that expressed a different relationship with time than youth typically manages the cedar post barn older than Earl himself, the fencing a mixture of decades, the newest sections still bright with fresh galvanizing. Earl spread his sketches on the hood of his truck. Pencil on graph paper dimensioned carefully in handwriting that belonged to an era when men were taught penmanship as a form of respect for the person who would eventually read it. The design was sound throughout, with one modification Wren hadn't seen before: a hinged access panel in the floor of the nest box section that allowed egg collection without opening the main coop door. She told him immediately that it was better than her own design. Earl folded the sketches without visible satisfaction, the way a man folds something he knew was right before the confirmation arrived. They built it over 2 weekends. Earl's grandson Travis, 16, visited on a school break and helped with the lifting. Dale appeared on the second Saturday without being asked, driving over with the bed of his truck loaded with remnant steel conduit from the Callaway Stockworks build. It fit Earl's frame dimensions within an inch. Nobody remarked on this. Earl put on coffee. Travis held conduit sections while Dale and Earl negotiated the welding sequence with minimal words and maximum understanding. The way men who have been working with their hands for 50 years negotiate everything through the hands themselves, through the material, through the quality of attention each brings to the shared problem. Wren watched the two old men work and understood something that the 8 months since June had been building toward, in the way understanding builds gradually below the surface until it surfaces whole. What was moving through Kerr County wasn't an idea she'd imported. It was an idea that had been here already, dormant in the ground the way bluestem lies dormant through drought, waiting for the conditions that allow it to express itself. The note in the old toolbox was not a curiosity. It was evidence of a continuity she'd interrupted and then restored, and the restoration was what was spreading. At Callaway Stockworks, the first rotation of 2023 began in early May, 3 weeks before fly pressure typically peaked. The second-year hens moved with the practiced certainty of animals who knew what the open coop door meant and what a fresh paddock offered. The replacement pullets added in January were still learning, occasionally distracted by things that weren't larvae, still requiring social instruction from the older birds about the actual job. By mid-May, they'd learned enough. Dale checked the coop tires before the first move of the season without being asked. Wren noticed. He began noting when a paddock was ready before she'd consulted her rotation schedule, which meant he was tracking the timing on his own. She noticed this too and said nothing about either thing. On a Saturday morning in late May, she was doing the first systematic fly count of the new season when Dale appeared at the paddock fence, hands in pockets, present without announcement. He watched the hens work for a while. The morning was cool, still the sun not yet over the eastern ridge, the grass wet with dew that the birds moved through without concern. He reached into the chest pocket of his worn chambray work shirt and produced a piece of paper folded in quarters, the folds soft with handling. He held it out to Wren across the fence. She took it, unfolded it. The graph paper, the pencil lines in a shaking hand. Chickens follow cattle. Always. Don't let the ground go dead. Dale's voice came out the way it came out when he'd decided something completely. He wrote that for me when I took over from him. I think he meant it for whoever was going to pay attention to it. He looked out at the hens moving through the morning light. Turns out that wasn't me. Wren held the paper. She didn't speak for a moment. The hens worked. A mockingbird started up in the cedar line along the north fence. The air held the clean smell of wet limestone and early grass, the kind of hill country morning that exists in a narrow window before the heat claims it. She folded the paper back along its existing creases and put it in the breast pocket of her flannel shirt over her sternum, where she could feel its slight weight with every breath. Inside, she could hear Marge in the kitchen. A door upstairs. Lena was awake, which meant within 20 minutes there would be coffee and the conversation Lena had been circling toward for 2 days. Wren had seen the folder on the kitchen table the previous evening, a different folder from any she'd used, stuffed with printouts on dung beetle population recovery and soil carbon cycling and rotational grazing systems, margin notes in Lena's cramped urgent script. Wren had sat across from her own father at that same table and laid out 3 pages and said she wanted to put chickens behind the cattle. She remembered the quality of that silence and what it had cost her to sit in it without filling it with words that would have made it easier for her rather than more honest. Lena was going to need someone to sit across from her and hear it out. Not to accelerate it, not to validate it before the work had been done, not to make it easier than it needed to be. Just to sit there and let the next person who had learned to look at the ground explain what they had seen. She turned from the fence and walked back toward the house, boots in the wet grass, the yellow notebook under her arm, the folded paper moving with her breathing. The coop would move tomorrow to the paddock just east of the water trough where the cattle had been grazing since Wednesday. The timing was right, 3 days from deposit to disruption, the window that everything depended on, not too soon and not long enough for the next generation to take flight. The interval that turned a problem into a practice. She pushed open the back door. Coffee smell reached her before anything else. Outside, the day was warming in the first hour of the sun dew burning off the limestone outcrops, the blue stems standing straight in the east paddock where no one had walked yet. By mid-morning, the heat would be serious. By noon, it would ask things of you. But in that first hour, the air held. The cattle grazed. The chickens worked the ground with the unhurried thoroughness of animals that understood their job completely. The ground received what it was given. It gave back what it could. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.